Okay. First, thank you again.
Sure.
I appreciate you taking the time. Yeah. And before we start, I wanted to touch just on kind of my research into you. You seem like a very eclectic person. And I was very impressed with just kind of your versatile career. Thank you for your service, just to start.
Yeah.
I find it really interesting, and to me it's exciting to see someone that I'd consider to be pretty eclectic representing a group of people, just because if I'm going to assume that you have kind of a wide view on a lot of different things. So I just kind of wanted to start. Could you kind of tell me about your versatile career and how being in different places have helped you now?
Sure. Well, I would say the legislature overall is pretty versatile, and it's really useful for having kind of, I would say, experts in their fields in a whole lot of different areas to be able to, tap on that person's shoulder and kind of ask them their opinions. I mean, we've got nurses, whether it's RNs or nurse practitioners. We've got realtors. We've got, as you pointed out, people who've owned bars. We've got people who have been in the cyber world. So, and in my experience, I've got a couple of different things I've done in my life. One, as you pointed out, I was in the military, but a number of our members have been in the military, and so that's not necessarily special from an expertise standpoint. But I was hazmat tech certified in the Army. I was in the chemical corps, so that is more unique.
Wow.
And so there's been a few bills that have come up related to different types of hazmat type things, and so all of a sudden, what I have to say becomes more relevant. So there's that, and then also, even with my extended family, involved in the nuclear industry, and so I'm on the utility committee as well, because I have some connection there and understand that more than your average person. But I've done a lot of things, and honestly, the way it all kind of worked out is I graduated college in 2006. Yeah, 2006. And end of 2006. And I was always interested in the political world. That was kind of something I wanted to do. But 2006 and 2008 were not very friendly to Republicans. They lost a lot of elections around the country and in our state. And so there wasn't necessarily as much opportunity in that arena for somebody like me. And so I looked for other things to do. And so I worked in, I joined the service. I worked in retail. I told you before, and as part of being in the service, a lot of times you learn to drive big vehicles. And so now, as my part-time job to supplement my income from the legislature, I drive freight trucks now because I learned that skill in the military. And so, it's been an interesting road. Right before I got elected, I used my chemical background I worked at a chemical plant. So it's been an interesting road to get to where I am now. But this is really what I've wanted to do for a long time. Not Congress, not governor, not state representative. State representative has always been really what I've wanted to do. Even state senator hasn't really interested me all that much. It's always been state representative.
Why is that?
Because it's more real. You talk to a congressman one of these days, and how much time does that person really have to really delve into the actual policy, what they're working on? I mean, they're so busy fundraising. They're so busy literally running. I mean, they run from meeting to meeting. And I'll grant you that happens sometimes here in this Capitol building when I have 5 committees running all at once. And sometimes I got to rush around the building. But I'm actually directly involved in writing policy. I'm directly involved in writing legislation. In the federal Capitol, congressmen aren't doing that for the most part. It's staff. And yes, obviously there's lobbyists involved all the time. You want to hear what different interested parties have to say on things. Lobbyists get a bad rap, and I get why, but it's not entirely fair because they're representing the people they represent. They're trying to get their viewpoints across. But in the federal Congress, it's just so much that you've got the entrenched staff and you have the lobbyists, and they kind of do all of this. Leadership offices do all of this. Here at the state level, you're actually involved in the policy. You're actually writing it and delving into the actual text to make and try to figure out what's best for your state.
Okay, I love that. I'm going to take one step back because I didn't ask. Could you introduce yourself and give us your occupation or title as well?
Yeah, so the official title, if you want to get really official, is Representative to the State Assembly. My name's Shae Sortwell. I represent the 2nd Assembly District, which right now, and we'll see what the courts do with it, but right now, my district runs from Two Rivers on Lake Michigan, just north of Manitowoc, west to the Fox River, and then north up to the city of De Pere.
Okay. Awesome. I'll mark those ones off. And, you mentioned that you kind of like being involved with, crafting a lot of these bills. And I saw just kind of on your website that you're very involved with a handful of committees. Could you tell us a little bit about what Assembly Bill 861 is?
That's a number. I'd have to look it up. Which one is that?
Sorry, that's the one on decriminalizing marijuana.
Okay, that one's my decriminalization bill. Okay. Yes. There's a lot of numbers. We're up in the 1050s right now, I think. And so the numbers kind of, and remember the numbers are different in the Assembly versus the Senate. They're not the same number.
Gotcha.
So you can double that number. So we're up in the 2100s now.
Okay, if that's the case, I'm going to rephrase the question to get a little bit closer there.
So the decriminalization bill, the idea of that bill was to try to figure out where Wisconsin can move forward on marijuana policy, on cannabis policy, because right now we have very different viewpoints, particularly in the legislature, but in the public at large, and try to figure out where we can kind of come together on a standard that we can all deal with. Because obviously there are people in this legislature and in the public that want full legalized marijuana, regulated to some extent, and that's what they want to do. And there's other people out there that want, full-on criminalization. They would like to increase penalties, right? So you have those two very disparate views. And then you have a lot of people in between where I think there's the majority of Wisconsinites, which is they believe that maybe marijuana is not the best choice for people to be making, but they think that it's not necessarily their choice to make for another person, and they think the law enforcement has more important things to do with their time. Mm-hmm. So that's what this bill attempts to do is, and also right now, because we have some of these differing views across the state, particularly regionally, marijuana is treated very differently in different parts of the state. And so this bill attempts to establish a standard across the state where we're not treating it differently, where literally you can cross the street into the next municipality and all of a sudden, it can move to a felony versus it's a civil ordinance. It's a local ordinance where you pay $1, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's what this attempted to do. And because we had such disparate and big disagreements between the different parts of the state, the bill affects different parts in different ways. And so in some places you would actually see some increased penalties. In some places you'd see decreased penalties. But I think it's a reasonable approach. There's people that disagree on that.
And I'm curious because you're the only Republican that introduced this bill, and I know you authored this bill. How did your peer party members or maybe even constituents respond to this? And how did you kind of get involved with this in the first place?
Well, I will tell you, I'm not the first Republican that supported this bill. The first person that I'm aware of, first Republican to introduce a version of this bill, would be Representative Jarko from several sessions back. He actually left the legislature at the same time I came in, so I've never served with the gentleman. But I started with his bill, and I introduced it, I think, pretty much as he wrote it the first time around. Okay. And then as we started to kind of work our way through the policy and how the state has continued to change and different municipalities have done different things to try to address a number of different issues across this. And so, it's a little bit of a running joke with some of my colleagues that I'm the pot Republican. But nevertheless, I don't think, it's not a negative thing, because by and large, I think even a lot of Republicans, even legislators, are of a similar opinion that marijuana does not necessarily need to be treated in the same way that it's being treated now. And the fact that this took a balanced approach, I think, was appreciated by a number of them. I would guess that I'm the only one that I introduced it, and I didn't get any co-sponsors, but I have in previous sessions gotten Republican co-sponsors. Not everyone feels the need to co-sponsor every bill just because it's out there. There's lots of bills that I vote for that I've never co-sponsored because it just didn't speak to me in some special way. I would guess if we actually had a vote on it among Republicans in the Assembly, the Senate's a little bit of a different animal, but in the Assembly, I would guess, I think I'd be fairly comfortable in saying I would get 20 Republicans that would probably vote for it if it actually came to a vote, just offhand, without my if you just asked them where they were on that general idea, I think probably give or take 20 of them without even needing convincing would probably support that general idea.
And, kind of to speak towards the grounds against legalization, at least from a legislative point, are they substantial? What are the arguments against it that you've heard and seen?
It's nothing new, really, and that's particularly why it's the bigger hurdle is in the Senate. The arguments against marijuana have, for the long time been, it's a gateway drug. You do that, next thing you know, we're going to have big problems. They point to Colorado and say, yeah, you've got tax revenue out there, but at the same time, you've got skyrocketing crime rates out there, and is that because of the marijuana? I think Colorado is an outlier anyways, from both the tax perspective and the crime perspective, because of course they were the first ones. Well, if they're the first ones, people who are really enthusiastic about using, they're moving to Colorado, right? And now that a number of states have some sort of legalized program, many states do, no matter what we did, you're not going to have that giant draw. But anyways, so yeah, I mean, it's a gateway drug. It's drug driving, that in fact people are going to be driving under the influence. Alcohol is we already have an alcohol problem in Wisconsin. Why do you want to add a mind altering substance to the mix? So it's not new, but it's. I also don't think many of the arguments hold there's not a lot of credibility to most of those arguments.
Yeah, and that's the reason why I kind of asked, because of my research through it. I've looked on websites like the WMC, and they have a big page that kind of brings up some statistics. Mm-hmm. And to me, I don't think they're quite substantial, just because one of the surveys they took from the National Institute of Health cites a study from the 1990s on postal workers, and especially to your point with OWIs and kind of drinking in the state, and the mention of more kind of inebriated drivers is complicated as well because mm-hmm. of how sustained THC stays in the system.
Right.
So that's another key thing.
Yeah.
Is working through the data and kind of really seeing.
And that's what I've seen some of the studies they'll point to Colorado saying, look how many more people are showing THC in the system that are drunk drivers now too, and so is this compounding the problem? And okay, I could see that. You could certainly make the argument, but at the same time, it's like, naturally, I would say that obviously, if you're somebody who is using alcohol, and to excess, so you're drunk driving, you're probably the same type of person that is also utilizing other mind-altering substances. And if there's other legal ones out there, then of course you're going to use that. Did that increase the likelihood that he was going to be operating under the influence? Or was it simply that he used marijuana within the last month? The data is not necessarily there. And it's interesting because, there's actually some really fantastic technologies out there, if you haven't seen them, that we've been developing to actually test not just have you had marijuana recently, but are you under the influence? There's actually one that's developed right here in Wisconsin.
Really?
Yeah. It was out in New Richmond, and now they moved over to the technology, incubation center right outside of Lambeau Field. They developed a retinal scanning device where they first developed it for the NFL to scan for
concussions.
Yes. But they figured out that they could design a different program and use the same technology to figure out, are you actually under the influence of THC? And they said, according to their studies, they're actually running through FDA approval, my understanding, last I heard. But their tests are showing they have like a 99% accuracy. And so their big issue right now they're trying to figure out how can they make it more portable, because right now it's basically the size of a monitor, a computer monitor. You have to sit at a desk and do this, and they'd like to be able to try to make this more roadside, so just like a breathalyzer, you can have that in your police officers' cars, because I think that's the greatest holdback for Republicans in particular. Is obviously we're very friendly with law enforcement. We tend to be very supportive of our police officers and listen to a lot of what they have to say. And the main thing I hear from law enforcement related to this is driving under the influence. If we can solve that concern and say, okay, let's fund marijuana breathalyzers on the side of the road, because it's not the same as the swabs and anything else, which don't really give you the full picture of whether somebody's actually under the influence. We solve that, and I think a lot of that resistance goes away.
Okay, so kind of if you could just reiterate, it kind of sounds like one of the main things is, dealing with kind of weed OWIs.
Yeah.
And what else kind of are just the main concerns?
Weed OWIs, the basic idea that it's a cultural thing, that it's a bad substance. We are encouraging people into bad habits. It's a gateway drug. So those two things, I would say those are the two main ones. And maybe a liability standpoint. You mentioned WMC before, but there's certain things you could do to protect employers from a liability standpoint. That's actually in my decrim bill, to try to get those folks on board too, so that if they were less stringent on what people were doing in their homes, then they wouldn't necessarily take on liability because of that. So I would say that's the third one. So it's OWI, kind of a societal, or is this a gateway drug kind of thing, and liability are probably your three concerns, I would say, primarily.
Okay. Do you think that it's a gateway drug?
I think it could be a gateway drug for some people, sure. I mean, different people, the thing to understand about any substance, and a whole lot of other activities that we participate in, different people react to different stimuli in different ways. There are people who can play video games, and it's fun. I usually play video games about once a week with my kids. It's usually Sunday afternoons. We have time when we play video games. Not every Sunday afternoon, but many Sunday afternoons.
What games do you guys play?
Oh, mostly old stuff. I have an old GameCube, and we shoot each other on Medal of Honor or whatever. He's got a new-ish Xbox, and so he's bought a couple new shooter games.
Okay.
What does he have? I don't remember now, but he's much better on those ones because, well, I don't know if he's much better. I'm much worse because I haven't been playing it for 25 years, right? So he wins those ones much more often than the one on the GameCube, but. But there are people that get addicted to that, and that's all they do, and they get absorbed in those worlds, right? And the same thing is true for alcohol. It's true for marijuana. It's true for anything. Chemicals affect people different ways. So could it be a gateway drug for some people? Sure. But I, as a more libertarian individual, I don't believe that it is government's job to try to stop you from making bad choices in your life. I've told people before, it's an amusing note on this issue that, and I can say this with a straight face, and I said it, and I had to take a lie detector test once for a job I took. I work for an armored car company, so I was eclectic. Work for an armored car company, and they want to make sure you're not going to steal their money, right? And one of the questions they asked me was, have you ever smoked marijuana? And no, I have never tried it. Never. I think I've smelled it once or twice on people, but otherwise I've had no experience actually, using it in any way. But it's about the general idea of what is government's proper role, and government's proper role is not how do I make people make what I think is the best choices for their lives. I mean, it's the ultimate in the Republican ideal of personal responsibility, isn't it? I mean, so often Republicans say that, and they don't necessarily uphold that principle of personal responsibility and personal consequences. And I think using pot, depending on how you use it, can result in bad things. But it's not my job to stop that unless you're actually hurting somebody else, which is where, drug driving comes into play. Then you're affecting somebody else's freedoms, and you should be prosecuted.
Okay. Very well said. And, one of the main reasons I'm doing this whole thing is to kind of, I definitely lean more towards advocation, but I'm not hard selling legalization. I just seek to kind of reframe what we think a drug is in this state, and how cannabis compares to alcohol, especially in a state where, our drinking culture is huge, and we've had a culture built upon, a tavern league and very important hospitality and service. And I don't know. I'm curious to your thoughts on kind of the idea that they're similars. They're very kind of similar drugs per se, and that's how I think a lot of people feel in the state is that, you know, it's not a Schedule I substance. If anything, it's...
Well, it is right now.
True, but just some popular opinions are that they feel that it shouldn't be,
right.
And that it's almost equatable exactly to alcohol in a sense. Do you have any thoughts on kind of that argument?
I see where they're coming from as far as that goes. You know, the most ironic part to me about this entire discussion is how it was treated for a long time until the 1920s. You know, Republicans like to harken back to the good old days. And what was interesting in the 1920s is you had a group of politicians and other civil leaders in the Republican Party and the Democrat Party that both of them kind of came together in this progressive idea that somehow government was going to fix all of our societal ills. A lot of bad things came out of those movements if you actually look at the history. The eugenics programs came out of that, the sterilizations of certain people, including American Indians. It wasn't all that disconnected with the Nazi pogroms of Germany.
Yeah.
And that was at the same time we had alcohol prohibition, and it was the same time that we had now put in place marijuana prohibition. And so, and I'm not necessarily equating all of those things. Obviously, there's a big difference between sterilization and other genetic warfare that they performed. There's a big difference between that and prohibition. Nevertheless, it was this mindset that somehow government was going to establish a utopia if we could just get rid of the bad things in society, whatever those bad things were. It's nonsense. Government is never going to eliminate bad things from happening. You can't. I mean, human nature is human nature. People want to do, even if somehow you could establish it. There was a study I heard, I don't know if you've ever heard of Jordan Peterson. He's somewhat of a controversial figure these years. Yeah. But he talked about that there was a study, I remember him talking about the study, and I looked it up, where they had a bunch of rats in a cage, and they gave them everything they could possibly want. And as soon as they did that, it resulted in horrible things because they didn't want perfection. They wanted to be you know, competing. You know, animals and people, we have kind of a competitive nature in general. And so anyways, it's a long way of saying that I think you certainly could treat it more like alcohol. I think the argument for that is pretty strong, that in fact, yes, it's a mind-altering substance, but it's not heroin. Moderate usage is going to have minimal impact on your life, minimal impact on society. Could there be that, you know, it might long-term, if you use it long-term, well, you could certainly mess with your lungs, just like cigarettes can, but cigarettes are also legal. And I think cigarettes are another bad idea, but they're legal. So I think the argument that somehow it's worse than any of those it really kind of falls on its face. Because if you want to say marijuana is a gateway drug, then sure, but so is alcohol. Because what kid who eventually starts doing hard drugs probably didn't have a drink first? I just don't see it. They started with the easy. You always start with the easy stuff to get, and it's easy to get alcohol, and it's, even though it's not legal, it's pretty easy to get marijuana.
And well said. And you know, I don't want to share too many of my personal opinions, but to that effect, I think I was raised on the premise of everything in moderation, and I think it goes to even things with caffeine. You know, you don't want to be drinking 3 pots of coffee every single day. I'd argue
another mind-altering drug, by the way.
Exactly, and keyword drug too. That's another thing. Is you go to a diner, you don't think you're drinking drugs when you have a cup of coffee. I have coffee every day, but it's just how we kind of think about the things, and anything in moderation. I think too much, like you said, of alcohol versus cannabis, they're both bad, you know?
I remember a guy, a friend of mine, actually brought back from Europe caffeine strips. Remember, it was a big thing for a while. Those like Listerine strips, they would dissolve. Well, these were just caffeine. And he brought them back from Europe, and it was just to make you awake, right? well, apparently it had so much caffeine in it, they weren't even legal in the United States. That's what he said. I don't know if he was right, but he said, yeah, just see, he gave me one or whatever. I'm sorry, maybe it was illegal, but don't tell the sheriff.
We don't need to-
I may have had a caffeine strip that was too much caffeine. That's what he said. He said you can't buy them in the United States.
That's so interesting. That sounds kind of scary because like those Listerine.
It woke you up.
I could imagine, but I appreciate your thoughts on that. I think that's very, very helpful, and I want to go back just to the bill a little bit too. What are some reasons why this bill wouldn't pass?
Well, there's the legislative side, and there's they say a good compromise makes everybody unhappy. And I think to an extent that might be true in this bill. I have seen some people who are advocates for marijuana reform rail against this bill and talk about what a terrible bill it is because we need full legalization. Okay, well, you're not going to get that right now. But some people are not willing to take some progress when they want it all. And they would point out that, it raises fees in some other parts in some other cities. They're not looking into the fact that, in fact, that's not completely true because that's discretion of the officer. So here's what people who listen to this might not understand. You think you're in Milwaukee or you're in Dane County, you're in Madison, and you're fine to use and it's never going to be a problem? Well, that could be true if what the officer does is issue you a local citation. But they have full discretion. They can actually issue criminal charges under state law. They have that authorization, and then it's up to the DAs if they want to charge it. But you're not necessarily fully off scot-free just because there is a local ordinance that could be enforced instead. So this takes away that uncertainty. But a lot of people don't understand that. They think that basically in Milwaukee it's basically legal. Well, no, it's not basically legal. It could be enforced differently depending on what a prosecutor or a police officer decide to do with you when they found you. And this is a difficulty with the law in general, where we see people will propose a law saying let's criminalize XYZ. And sometimes it covers more. If you really think through all the scenarios, it could cover things that rational people would say, okay, it shouldn't be applied in that case. That should not be a crime under those circumstances. And I've always said, well, let's try to amend the bill to make sure it doesn't cover those circumstances. And too often I've had colleagues come back and say, well, no DA would ever prosecute it for those reasons. So we can leave the discretion in there and DA will be fine with that. Well, you think so, until sometimes a district attorney doing their job uses those possible charges as leverage. Say, I can charge you for this, and I know I've got you for this. We see that with bail jumping, to be honest, with bail jumping charges, because the way things are set up in Wisconsin, what bail jumping technically is, which is not even bail jumping in the traditional sense. But it can be used because they have you dead to rights on one thing, so they can get you to plead guilty on other things. And so, but that's the issue with that on the liberal side in particular is they think they've already pretty much got what they want in some of the liberal cities, Milwaukee, Madison, etc. They don't, but they think they've got it. On the conservative side of things, then you've got the same people who think we're just being, soft on crime and encouraging people to use it. And so you kind of got two groups of people, and to be honest, who tends to end up in the legislature, it tends to be people who win their primaries, and people who win their primaries tend to be the kind of the hardcore from whatever party that is, and the Democrat Party these days is pretty hardcore on the left, and the Republican Party is pretty hardcore on the right. And so, and not even just who they are personally, but the constituency that tends to holler at them the most on issues. I mean, I think it was this issue, I'm not positive because the guy refused to talk to me, but I had one of my largest donors when I introduced this bill a few years ago. He not only did he not donate to me anymore, he wouldn't even talk to me anymore. He wouldn't even open the door. I tried to drop off we have these books, they're called blue books that you're just giving away every year. And I tried to drop off a blue book at his house in part as an excuse to figure out why he was so angry at me. But he looked at me through the window, shook his head, and walked away. So
Was that the last time you saw him?
That was the last time I've seen him, yes. So you've got some very passionate people on certain issues, and this is one of them. I personally don't get why this issue gets as much passion as it does on either side, because I can look at this kind of dispassionately and rationally and think, okay, where am I going to fall on this issue? But it doesn't personally mean all that much to me. It's just like, I think this is the right position, but it's not like, oh, we must get this or we must not get this. But a lot of people think very differently on this.
Yeah, and I'm with you, where I try to look at it objectively and kind of look at what are the pros, what are the cons. With this bill, I see your argument for standardizing the legal process, and I'd want to ask you kind of the current problems with, the legislation around getting caught with possession, because I feel it's very punitive in the state in some parts. You said, Dane County, Milwaukee, you might be better off because of the local jurisdictions. But, if you get caught, up around the UP, they're not happy with that up there at all by any means, and it could be really bad. So I guess to summarize, I see it in a lens of, I see a lot of positive that comes from, at the least, decriminalization. I also see positives with legalization. And where I have trouble is seeing kind of the substantial arguments against supporting these kind of things outside of personal opinion.
I think largely the people who oppose it are looking at this from, what's good for society more so than how bad is it. And so, unfortunately, they're falling into that trap that Republicans aren't supposed to fall into, of using government to, craft a society you want to see, rather than, allowing individuals to make individual choices, working with your local churches. I'm a very religious person, working with your local churches to try to encourage people to not turn to drugs for the answer to your problems in life. But unfortunately, a lot of Republicans on this issue, for whatever reason, have turned to government. And it was really funny. I had a little forum a couple of years ago with myself and a gentleman from Colorado who was a mayor out in Colorado, decriminalized. He was one of the first in the country to do it. He was a mayor out there in Colorado. And we were on one side, and then there was a local radio host who was very much against marijuana on the other side. And I really took him aback when I accused him of being a progressive, because he's a very conservative guy. And it really took him back, because he thought I was going to argue for tax revenue and everything. I'm like, I'm not looking for tax revenue. I don't think we need to try to find new ways to take money from the people. So tax revenue is not a way I'm not arguing for that for legalization. But I accused him of being a progressive, because I said, you've bought into the argument that somehow government is going to fix our problems. And that's not a conservative argument. Conservative argument says, let people have liberty and let the chips fall where they may, and use families and churches to encourage people to good moral behavior. I mean, that's what churches and families are supposed to be there for, is to encourage people in good moral behavior, living rightly before God. I mean, that's not government's job to do it. It's government's job, even from a religious standpoint, and you go into the Bible on this. The purpose of government is to punish wrongdoers, is to punish people who hurt other people. That's right out of Scripture. And yet, nevertheless, we are going to use somehow this idea of a moral society to go beyond what religious text ever told you to do. It's bizarre. It's a bizarre situation.
I really like that. And, that just because this will be kind of a shorter piece, is there a way you can kind of reiterate that kind of back to the weed issue too? Just kind of summarize what you said just about, government and kind of using this moral lens to kind of...
Yeah. So as it relates to specifically weed, we have to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of government? And I would hold that the purpose of government is written in the Declaration of Independence. That it says that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. And that idea is actually to be found in Scripture, is to be found biblically. And I'm a very religious person. And so that this idea, it's to punish wrongdoing. And by wrongdoing, it's when you harm other people. The very 10 Commandments, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not murder. It's about harming other people. And that's the purpose of government. And that's why when you're talking about the, drug driving, wherever, now you're harming other people. But unfortunately, you've got some people from a part of religious standpoint think that somehow we can apply instead a moral lens to our through government and somehow establish a moral society, when a moral society, in my view, is never going to truly come about through government. A moral society is going to come about when churches and families, realize our proper place, and in my view, submitting humbly before our God. It can't happen with government. Government can't do that, and that's why we've got the First Amendment. Not having establishment of religion, right? Because you can establish it, but you're not going to actually accomplish anything. I mean, it has to come from the heart, and if it doesn't come from the heart, you're not going to get there. And so, I just think on the marijuana issue, the solution to people using this substance poorly, because like you said, I personally don't think that using it in small amounts is all that much different from alcohol, but I'm against people personally against people being in a drunken stupor every night when they get home from work. I don't think it's the right way to live your life. I don't think you should go home and get a high on marijuana every night when you get home. It's not a good way to live your life. But you will never accomplish that legislatively. You can only accomplish that interrelationally with your families, with your churches. That's the only way you're getting there. It can't be done with government.
That was fantastic. Thank you. That was great. I'm getting pretty much to the end of this. I don't want to take up too much of your time. But is there kind of anything else you'd want to add kind of on your involvement with this issue, kind of your thoughts on just maybe the medical bill that's going through or legalization in general?
We have the medical bill that's working its way through. Unfortunately, I think it's stalled again. That's what I heard, and that's frustrating to me because I did co-sponsor the bill early on, even when we first put it out. It's not the version I would like to see. I'm a very free market individual, so I'm not a big fan of government running anything if I can help it. So the fact that it's state-run dispensaries is not perfect in my view, but highly regulated is better than completely illegal. And so, I did co-sponsor that. The Senate is an uphill battle. They claim that they want it more free market over there. Well, then I would challenge them. Pass one more free market and send it over to the assembly. I'll be happy to fight for that. Right now, I know the speaker would really rather keep it more highly regulated because he's very much against actual legalization of recreational.
Yes, he is.
So he wants to keep the medical program as far away from the free market as possible. That's why he wants the government run. I get that. But we can't have the discussion if they're not willing to also engage on it and say, okay, well then pass it the way you want it and send it on over. Republicans in the Senate haven't even introduced anything this session. They have in the past. But then if you've got the votes for the free market side of it, then great. Pass it, send it over to us. And then we can have that discussion in our caucus where we want to come down on it. Because right now, we've got our bill, and last I heard, it's not moving because the Senate basically said, we're not going to pass it. Well, if you're not going to pass ours, then why would we go through the effort and piss off those people who won't even take my phone calls or answer the doors anymore? Why take on that political damage? Because it's to our side. There's a fair number of people who are against this, and so why take that on if we're not actually going to get to the goal?
Okay, and could you help explain, if possible, why Senate Republicans just kind of stay at a stalemate with this issue, or just kind of, is it reflective of their constituents? Is it an influence of something else?
I think the main issue with the Senate in general on this issue is how long they've been in politics. And I don't mean that in a negative way necessarily, but in the Assembly, most of us have been elected much more recently for the first time. And so we've been, the average in the Republicans, I'm not sure about the Democrats, but in the Republican caucus, very few people serve more than 3 terms. I'm in my 3rd term right now. I anticipate being around for a while because I love this job. But I'm kind of unique in that most people, once they've been, but my first time was 5 years ago. Okay. Most senators were elected their first time a decade plus ago, at least. And marijuana back then, even among Democrats, was far less of a favorable topic. I mean, one Democrat, she just retired from the state Senate, who was replaced by Senator now, Quinn, up north. She was against recreational marijuana. I mean, that was literally a year ago. They still had a senator from the Democrats, who obviously are more friendly to marijuana in general, in the state Senate saying no to recreational marijuana. And so I think it's not generational from the public's standpoint, because there's a lot of elderly people that would like to use it for medicinal purposes. But more seasoned politicians are still thinking about it in the same way that the public thought about this policy 15 years ago. And I think that's the problem in the Senate. Even in the Assembly, more of the people who are in the Assembly that are more resistant on the marijuana legislation on the Republican caucus, not all of them, but if they would have been here for longer, like Robin Voss. He's been here significantly longer than most of the rest of us. He's been here for about 20 years.
Wow.
Well, he fits in with all the senators on that then. That he's okay with the medical, but he would never go beyond that. And I think that's the problem.
Okay. So interesting. And I think you're right, even just the past few years, because when I talked to Representative Swearingen earlier today, I think he still opposes it, but compared to a video I saw on his Facebook from 2019 where they went to the UP, they kind of toured around and saw what their shops looked like, he was pretty vehemently against it, and it seemed like this, to your point, this dissolution of a moral society. It was kind of just, this is bad for us, we got to fight it. And when I mentioned it, kind of, because we talked about drinking culture and how Wisconsin likes to celebrate, is how he put it. We're a state that enjoys a celebration.
Yeah.
And I asked him, is there room for cannabis in the celebration? Like, what does that look like? And he seemed, not put off by it or not up in arms, and, at least to entertain it more. So it's interesting to see that kind of sway. And, you would be closer to the issue than me, but from what I feel is it feels that the momentum is moving that way, and kind of publicly there's more of a trend.
It's getting there, and I think you're going to see that more and more in the Assembly in particular. Because we have such turnover in the Assembly. So, I mean, go and check with the newly elected representatives from the last 2-3 terms. I couldn't speak for sure, but I'll bet you 3 out of 4 of them are probably a lot more friendly to it than the people who have been here for 10 years.
Okay.
I mean, I can think of some right offhand that I know are more friendly to it. Now, interestingly enough, one of the guys that's most friendly to it has actually been here for a very long time on the Republican. Well, Mursaw is very friendly to the medical. He's been here for quite a long time. He's not a fan of recreational, because I think he's still hung up on that. But I think over the next few years, as we have more turnover in the Assembly, and you'll have that in the Senate too, but there's a longer delay on it, and it is what it is. Okay. But even in the Senate now, you've got several Republicans that are openly supportive of reform on this. I mean, you got Cabral Caveira from Appleton. You got Senator Quinn from the Northwoods there, who replaced a prohibitionist Democrat on this issue, ironically enough. On the medical side, I know Jesse James is supportive. That's on the medical. I don't think he likes recreational. He's a police officer, so I can only go so far. But so Staff Schultz, another one I think is really open to the idea. Even the majority leader of our caucus, of August there, Representative August, I'll bet you if it came to a vote, I bet you he'd vote for recreational. I'll bet you. Don't quote me on it. That's a definite, because I don't think he's publicly said that. But just knowing how he thinks, I'll bet you he would, just because he thinks very kind of libertarian like I do. That if it's not the government's role, then why is the government doing anything on it? So I would guess. Okay. And he's probably going to be the next speaker whenever that happens.
Okay, good to know. And I just have one more quick one before I want to just open up the floor if you have anything else to say. But if you had to guess, how many years do you think until it would be legalized recreationally in Wisconsin?
Full recreational? I don't know. In all honesty, part of the issue, and this seems counterintuitive, but I think there's truth to it, is right now we're going through a redistricting fight with the Supreme Court. That will probably result in more Democrats being elected. That will probably not result at least in the Assembly, maybe the Senate, but probably, depending on how things work out, I think the Republicans are going to be able to hold on to the majority in the Assembly because we work harder for the seats, we have better candidates, we're better connected with our communities in general. So I think even under maps drawn to help Democrats, they explicitly said that's what they're doing, I think we'll have the majority. I think that actually hurts the chances of marijuana reform. And the reason I say that is because we have no votes to spare. So the unwritten rule in the legislature is, with very few exceptions, we need 50 Republicans, which is a majority. 50 Republicans is 50 votes in the Assembly. 50 Republicans to pass anything. Well, if I got 64 Republicans, I can lose 14 Republicans and still pass policy. And as we had more turnover, that would be helpful for some of those. We could get up to 50, I think. If we're down at 53, which best guess is under most of the maps I've seen, we end up somewhere between 52 and 59, give or take, maybe, give or take. All of a sudden, I got a lot fewer Republican votes I can lose. And the other issue, too, is as part of that redistricting, the Democrats, the partisan, the liberals in the court have to draw super Republican districts. They have to gerrymander some of us into super Republican districts in order to lessen our impact, in order to give them more competitive districts for Democrats to be able to win more, right? So for instance, in my neck of the woods, they take the city, under one of the proposals, they take the city of De Pere away from me. The city of De Pere is about a 50-50 city. It could go either way. They take that away from me and they give me a bunch of towns that are 70% Republican, which makes me very happy, I suppose. I get a very Republican district. But what's the result of that? That means primaries matter more. Primaries matter a lot more because your general election isn't going to matter anymore for some of us. There's going to be 30 or so seats under these maps, at least, that are 60+% Republican, that a Republican can never lose, which means all you ever have to do is hold on to your primary. So right now, I actually think I think that could hurt the chances, is because there's going to be 30 or so Republicans, so roughly 2/3 of the possible caucus we could end up with, 30 of 50 or 35 of 60, are going to say absolutely not, because the hardcore Republicans in my district don't want it. So I think that's a problem, and I don't think Democrats are thinking it through because they think they're going to be able to get a majority, but I don't think it's going to happen. So unfortunately, on the recreational side of things, I don't think it's happening anytime soon. Medicinally, maybe. Decrim, maybe. But unfortunately, I think the maps actually make it less likely, unless somehow the Democrats pull a full majority of both houses. That could happen, but the numbers and history doesn't support that.
Yeah, I don't think Wisconsin's quite there yet, but
no, because you look at, just under the maps and look at figuring out numbers and everything. Can Democrats win under those maps? Yeah, that's why they drew them that way, but probably not. And with the way the Senate works, half of them are elected every 2 years. Well, you'd have to have 2 really good elections in a row then in order to flip the Senate. So even if we lost the Assembly in 1 year, we'd have another year to either try to get it back or before the Senate could fall, right? And so it's, unless you lost a ton of seats, but it's just probably not going to happen. So unfortunately, for people who want to see reform on that, the maps argument is probably not going to help you.
Interesting. Okay. And that's pretty much everything I have that I wanted to talk on. Do you have anything else about yourself, about this issue, about anything else you'd want to share with me or the world?
I guess I would just, to put a pin in my political philosophy, which is just, I mentioned before the Declaration of Independence that says that to secure rights, governments are instituted among men. I would put a pin in that and note that all legislation that I face, I really try to look at it in that way, and try to, when I see a bill and I'm reading it, I ask myself, does this enhance the liberty of the people? And if the answer to that is yes, then I should be supporting the bill. If the answer to that is no, then I should be against it. And sometimes that puts me voting against my own party. Sometimes it puts me voting against the whole legislature. I have been the only no vote on a couple of bills. because I looked at that and said, well, wait a second, why should we be giving money to XYZ group of people? Why should I be giving taxpayer money to them? And I remember that, and it was really funny because the vote I'm thinking about right now, I can't imagine. I was shocked when the Democrats all voted for it, because it's like, you guys hate that group of people. Why you vote? Why you giving that? But I was just like, it's not my money. It's taxpayer money. I shouldn't just be handing it to somebody else just because I like that cause and they're donors or whatever. That's not the way to do things. So I would hope, and I have encouraged this to my colleagues so many times. Unfortunately, they don't do it, but they don't do it as well as they ought to. I think, because I think if you follow your conscience on these issues, and you are straight with your constituents, and you explain to them why you voted in a certain way that may seem counterintuitive, but you walk them through it, they'll understand and appreciate that you're not just, blowing smoke up their butts. It's not like I'm the law enforcement guy, so I'm going to vote this way. Well, great. And most of the time as a Republican, I vote for a lot of pro-law enforcement stuff. I voted against a bill, I think the only Republican, it may have been the only guy in committee at all the other day, which looks like a school safety bill. But it's a bill that violates the Fourth Amendment. And so I voted no. And so all of these things have to be at the forefront of your decisions in the legislature. And that's how I approach this issue, just like any other issue.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, I think that just about wraps it up, too. We've been chatting for almost an hour here, and this has been some great stuff. But
cool.
Thank you very much.
Thank
I really
you.
appreciate the time. I think we're good to cut if you want to.